Dawn hadn't even broken yet. But Ethan Cole was already there, standing in the midst of the bus station, his backpack hanging heavy like it carried the whole war on his shoulders. A crumpled scrap of paper slipped from the hand of some nameless passerby and landed at his feet. "Help me, Ethan." The shaky letters cut straight through the silence. He looked up and caught sight of Mason, a stranger with eyes sharp as a blade, the kind that made you feel he knew something you didn't. One wrong step, and both their worlds could turn upside down. The federal bus station before dawn felt like a pool of cold light. Rows of plastic seats lined up straight, still marked with damp patches where someone's shoulders had rested through the night. Low-hanging fluorescent bulbs flickered like they were short on breath, casting a pale green wash over the mottled tile floor. At the far end, where the brick wall held a faint warmth from the heater humming behind it, Ethan Cole sat hunched in a fleece-lined jacket. His hood was pulled low, shadow covering half his face. In his hands, a vending machine coffee steamed just enough of the vapor to brush his cheek before dissolving into the damp air of early morning. The place smelled of wet rubber floors, cold metal railings, and stale cigarette smoke trapped in the window seams, blended into an atmosphere that felt both strange and familiar, like a waiting room between yesterday and whatever came next. On the black departure board, white letters crept slowly. 5 a.m. Winslow. Just enough to make you believe time was still on the side of those willing to wait. Near the ticket counter, the night clerk sat slumped in a thick sweater, chin resting on the back of one hand. In the middle of the room, a man in oil-stained work boots slept with his arms wrapped around a packed lunchbox. A young mother leaned forward, steadying her baby's head as it shifted in sleep, the child's breathing rough from the cold. Farther down, a kid in a hoodie was half-sprawled across two chairs, shoes still wet, toes pointing into the aisle. By the door, janitor's floor machine whispered along, leaving hook-shaped streaks of water on the tiles. Ethan set the coffee on the seat beside him, rough hands slowly warming the sides like an old field trick. Under his jacket, the dog tags rested flat against his shirt, cold, but not as heavy as they once felt. He'd left the rehab center in Tucson yesterday. 3 months of mornings with open windows, afternoons practicing breathing, and little notes taped to the mirror. Sleep enough, eat real, step outside. They told him to head somewhere with trees, open sky, and roads that knew how to keep quiet. The bus ticket in his pocket was soft from sweat, the print fading with moisture, but the name of his old hometown still showed clear, like a reminder that didn't need to shout. Nobody was looking at him. That was a relief. He liked the quiet. Quiet enough to hear his own breathing steady, to hear the heater hum like some big insect inside the wall. Here there were no sudden slams of steel doors, no heavy gates that jolted your heart, just the drip of water from someone's coat hitting the floor and breaking into a single dark spot. He pulled his backpack closer, black, frayed at the seams, the zipper sticking from sand caught in the teeth. On the strap, a loose strand of yarn from a knitted hat someone once sent from far away. He never cut it off, left it like a small charm. With one hand, he opened the zipper a few inches, checking the bare essentials: toothbrush, a clean shirt, half a pack of crackers, a soft-covered notebook. Inside, on the first page, his doctor's steady handwriting. Routine saves you on quiet days. He closed it and left it on top. A small act, but enough to feel like he was tending to something worth keeping. A quiet kind of joy, thin as coffee steam, but still joy. It came when he saw the janitor stop the machine, take off his own light jacket, and drape it over the shoulders of the sleeping kid. It came when the baby in the young mother's arms snuffled and turned toward her warmth, a tiny hand brushing hers. It came when a sparrow bumped into the window, shook itself, then disappeared into the dark, clumsy but alive. Joy showed itself in things that didn't have names, and he felt his heartbeat slow, steady. Not happiness, exactly, just a thin layer of warmth laid over the morning. Ethan shifted to rest his back against the wall. Habit. From that angle, he could see the whole room without moving much. His eyes moved slow. 2 exit doors, the small dome camera on the ceiling, the clerk at the counter, the side door wedged open with a broken latch. He counted the tiles from his seat to the exit, 5, 6, 7 big squares. His hand rested on his thigh, fingertips tapping the fabric in time with his breathing. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Calm came from steady actions, not empty effort. He tugged lightly at his collar, running a finger over the faint scar along his collarbone. No sting anymore, just cool skin. Outside, a freight train sounded far off, its horn dragging an imaginary wind through the dirty window glass. Overhead, a wooden vent cover rattled just enough to remind you everything was still doing its job. He lifted the coffee, took a small sip. Bitter. Huh. Rough on the tongue. But right now, that was the taste of being here. In his left jacket pocket, the ticket edge brushed his ribs with each deep breath. He didn't take it out, but the feel of that soft paper gave him a kind of resolve he didn't need to speak. The old town didn't promise him anything. Friends, if any, would be few. The house might belong to someone else. The trees could be gone for a new road. But if there was anything left worth keeping, a porch roof, a wooden fence, a scratched-up kitchen table, it would only last if someone stood between it and the wind. The will to protect, he realized, wasn't loud. It was like pressing his back to the wall now. Unthinking, absolute. A small coin sat in his right pocket, the one his squad mate had handed him before a bad mission. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the worn ridges. Not to remember the past, but to remind himself his grip was still strong. He could still hold on, still pass something forward. He slipped it back into his pocket, sat up straight, set down the coffee, tied his laces, tight enough for his ankles to feel sure. Small things, but each one carried its own promise. He was here, he was choosing to stay, and he was choosing to keep moving. The front doors slid open, letting in a rush of cold street air mixed with the damp smell of smoke. An older man in a faded ball cap stepped inside, the stitching on the brim showing the ghost of some long-ago unit name. He walked slow, stopped at the soda machine, fished for change in his pocket. A coin dropped into the tray, its metallic ring carrying longer than you'd expect, like a second hand tapping against glass. Ethan glanced over. Just glanced. No words. The presence of someone who'd walked through the same kind of hard was enough to straighten the spine of the other. In the far corner, the wall calendar had been flipped to a new day. The red number 1 stood out against white, a small spark of fire in a room washed in green light. Dawn hadn't broken yet. Outside, only a faint gray glow hovered where the awning dripped thin strings of water. Ethan lifted his pack, set it by his right foot, heel resting lightly on the strap like setting a latch. Another sip of coffee. He placed the cup back in the same spot on the seat step, this time over a fresh wet ring that matched the one just dried. He opened his notebook, wrote a single line. No frills, no explanation. Today, return. Black ink sank slow into the paper. He waited 10 seconds for it to dry, then closed it. His hood tipped up a notch. Jaw unclenched. Chest open a fraction more. Not because the world had turned kind, but because he decided to meet it face to face. Resolve didn't need a grand oath. Sometimes it looked like a man sitting straight at the end of a row of plastic seats, holding a cup of hot coffee in both hands, eyes on the world through fog glass, counting the flicker of a light to know he could still count. Somewhere across the room, the departure board gave a short, dry beep. 5 a.m. Winslow showed a shade bolder, like someone had just wiped the dust off the letters. Ethan drew in a long, slow breath, held it, let it go. The tile under his boots was cool. His back stayed firm against the wall. People in the room shifted slightly, getting ready for the next round of movement. Somewhere, the young mother's fingers tightened around her child's tiny hand without thinking. Somewhere, the jacket over the sleeping kid's shoulders got pulled up another inch. Morning hadn't arrived, but life was already stirring. There are mornings that don't need promises. Just someone sitting steady, keeping a cup of coffee warm, ready to stand when the doors open. In that kind of stillness, joy finds its way back in faint wisps of breath. The urge to protect rises with the feel of a wall at your back, and resolve grows out of small acts, tying laces, putting pen to paper, closing a notebook. Ethan Cole sat there, between the smell of rubber and smoke, between the hum of the heater and the departure board, keeping watch over a dawn that hadn't yet shown its face. And when it came, he'd stand, without hesitation. In his jacket pocket, the ticket pressed flat against his chest like a piece of paper that knew how to breathe. Thin stock, edges softened by sweat and the damp of cold mornings. Winslow printed in bold on white, with 5 a.m. just beneath it, the departure time. Only a few characters, but they weighed like a small stone lodged deep in his chest. He didn't take it out, didn't need to see it. He knew it was there, the same way he knew he was here, and the same way he knew that town's name marked a point he couldn't step around. A place he'd left years ago, carrying pieces of himself he wasn't sure he'd ever meant to keep. 3 months in therapy in Tucson had taught him to sleep deeper. No more shattering awake to flash bursts of dust and fire, or voices tearing through the dark. Now, there were stretches of unbroken night, enough for his body to feel like it had been soaking in warm water. But every time his eyes opened, the same question waited on the ceiling, right where the light was weakest. How will you live when you go back? Not should you or can you, but how will you when every street, every porch roof, every early horn in the morning could pull up memories you thought you'd buried? He looked through the fog glass. Outside, the street was still asleep. Yellow street lamps hung high, spilling their tired light onto rain-dark sidewalks, the glow pooling into soft blurs. A small utility truck sat tight against the curb, streaks of dried mud up its side. Nobody was in a hurry out there. The corner convenience store stayed locked, its open sign unlit. Only a gray cat emerged from an alley, crossed the street, its shadow stretching across the blacktop like a ribbon. A light wind swept through, lifting a few scraps of forgotten newspaper, spinning them once before they settled back down as if they'd never moved at all. Ethan's breath clouded the glass. He swiped at it with his sleeve, clearing a patch, though nothing outside had changed. From the outside, this kind of stillness might look like a gift. To him, it felt like waiting, a waiting that could go one of two ways, a slow, steady peace, or a storm building quietly. No one knew, not even him. His right hand drifted to the inside pocket where he kept a much smaller scrap of paper than the ticket, his doctor's list for when the weight in his chest started pressing down. Step outside, drink water, count your breaths, touch something that matters. That last part, touch something that matters, was tied to the ticket now. He wasn't sure if it brought him comfort or heaviness, but it mattered. It was the bridge between him and the place he'd once called home, even if that home had changed colors, owners, even the smell of the wood on the porch. A man walked past the row of seats, his work boots knocking against the tile. He stopped at the coffee machine, dropped in a coin, waited for the thunk of the paper cup. Ethan followed the motions, not out of curiosity, but habit, keeping track of what was around him. When the man turned, Ethan caught the faded patch of an old fire department on the shoulder of his jacket, a company long gone. For a moment, he knew. Some roads in life turn off the way yours did, and they keep going anyway. His eyes returned to the glass. A door opened a crack down the street, letting out a thin glow from a low-watt bulb inside. Maybe someone was making coffee. Maybe they were getting ready for a long drive. It sparked a strange kind of feeling in him, like finding a smooth stone in the pocket of an old coat. Not valuable, but it had been there through every season, still holding its shape. That feeling pulled something else with it, the urge to protect. He knew better than anyone that small things like that, a house lit before dawn, a cat crossing safe, a child asleep in a mother's arms, only lasted if someone stood guard, guarded them from cold, from hunger, from hands that had no right to touch. He didn't yet know what he'd be protecting in Winslow, but the want was there, as clear as the horizon line beyond the glass. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced. That stance used to mean be ready to move. Now it felt more like a way to anchor himself in the present. Heart steady, breath deep. Resolve didn't always come as a bright flash. It could be like an underground stream, fed by ordinary things. A ticket in your pocket, a fogged window, a street that hadn't yet woken up. A horn sounded far off, echoing through alleys and bouncing back off the glass like a knock at the door. Ethan lifted his head. The bus wasn't due just yet, but he knew he wouldn't miss it. Not from fear of being late, but because he'd already decided. When the door opened, he'd stand, walk out, and follow where that ticket pointed. No hesitation, no looking back. Whatever came next, he'd meet it step by step. Outside, the first stripe of dawn slid down the corner of the street, slow, like it was testing the day's temperature. And here, inside the station, Ethan Cole sat with the ticket warm in his jacket pocket, eyes fixed on a horizon just starting to change color. At the far end of the hall, a small shadow slipped past, quick enough to blur the line between a person and a draft pulling its own shape along. The overhead fluorescence flickered as it passed, like a blink. Nobody in the waiting room looked up. The night clerk kept his head on his desk. The young mother still swayed her child. The man with the lunchbox kept sleeping. Only Ethan, ears tuned to the smallest shifts, caught the careful rhythm. Thin soles on wet tile, deliberate and broken, like they were avoiding notice. He didn't turn his head, just let his eyes drift toward the hallway, taking in the angles of shadows along the wall. Years in the field had taught him, look too soon and you lose the target. So he kept with his current motion, fingers wrapping the coffee cup, sliding it an inch to lift it from a step. That's when he felt it, a tiny change in weight pulling on the left side of his body. The jacket pocket hung heavier than when he'd first sat down. It was subtle, but for a man who'd carried a pack for hours and could tell an ounce's difference, it was clear enough. Muscles in his back and shoulders tightened, not from fear, but from knowing something new had entered his space. Steam rose slow from the cup, curling under his nose. He stayed still, letting his gaze brush the edge of the pocket. Nothing showing. Fabric still flat, buttons still fastened. Only the weight was different. In the quiet of the station, the heater hummed on, water dripped from someone's coat. No sound gave away who had passed. Ethan set the cup down, reached into the pocket, thumb and forefinger slipping past the lining. His fingertips touched something soft and dry, folded, edges worn from too many hands. Flat, small, about the size of a child's palm. He drew it out gently, kept it in his open hand, eyes still forward. The cold white light from above caught the creases and faint gray smudges, marks of sweat and dust. In moments like this, time seemed to slow. His breaths stretched longer. The sounds around him thinned out, leaving only the steady, deep rhythm of his own. He'd received folded notes before, at checkpoints scrawled with coordinates, passwords, or hurried messages from a soldier trapped on the other side. Those scraps of paper always carried a weight far beyond their size. Now, the same feeling was back. Ethan turned the paper in his hand, feeling each crease. There were at least 4 tight folds, edges sharper than the body of the sheet. The paper was thin but tough, the kind torn from a cheap school notebook or a one-sided flyer. He thought of the small shadow that had passed, the careful footsteps. This wasn't random. Someone had placed it in his pocket instead of leaving it where anyone could see. And they'd chosen him, a stranger, out of a dozen others in the waiting room. He set the note on his thigh, fingertips resting on the top edge, ready to open it. But first, he looked around the room again. No one was watching. Down the hall, the side door stood slightly ajar, its hinge giving a faint cry as the wind pushed through. Light from outside stretched in a thin stripe across the floor, all the way to the step where he sat, like an invisible thread. He went back to the paper, unfolding each crease slowly. The sound of it opening was loud in the quiet, soft, papery, almost like a whisper. When the last fold came free, he saw shaky pencil handwriting, uneven and slanted, the letters leaning one way, then the other. Just a few words, but enough to tighten something in his chest. Please help my friend, being kept. Below it was a crude drawing, an L-shaped row of buildings, a staircase leading down, a thick arrow pointing to that lower section. No names, no address, no phone number. Just a stripped-down plea for help and a map. He held the paper there, eyes tracing every line. The uneven shading showed where the writer had pressed harder, maybe from a trembling hand, maybe to emphasize the point. In the lower left corner, there was a faint smudge, the kind a dusty or sweaty fingertip would leave. Ethan brushed it lightly with his finger, feeling the gritty drag of graphite on skin. Out in the hallway, the side door rattled again in the wind, the loose metal knocking against itself. Ethan looked up just in time to see a small figure flash across that strip of light, quick and deliberate, like an arrow disappearing into the dark. His instincts told him to stand, but he stayed seated one more beat, tracking the motion until it vanished around the corner. The stillness returned instantly, but the sense that he'd been singled out for something didn't fade. He folded the note once, just in half this time, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the place he kept things that mattered. The coffee cup sat where he'd left it, its steam mostly gone. He lifted it, took a small sip, the bitterness rolling over his tongue and warming a narrow line in his throat. Setting it back down, he tilted his head toward the side door, as if listening for any sign of footsteps that might still be there. There wasn't, just the sound of his own breathing, a heartbeat running a touch faster than usual, and a new thought forming. This note had found its way to him, and now it was his responsibility. No one else knew. No one else had seen it. And in that moment, in a quiet bus station before dawn, Ethan Cole realized that the smallest things, a passing shadow, the sudden weight in a pocket, could sometimes be the first step onto a road he never imagined he'd take. In his pocket was a quarter-folded sheet, the paper gone soft from passing through too many hands. The edges were frayed, some creases rubbed white, and when he smoothed a thumb across it, the dry grit of graphite clung to his skin. Under the cold fluorescent light, the words came up clear, "Please help my friend, being kept." No period, no name, just a plea that felt like it had been written in one quick breath. The handwriting was shaky, tilting slightly right, like it had been done in a rush, maybe on a knee, maybe on an unsteady surface. Below it, taking up nearly half the sheet, was a rough sketch, an L shape, uneven lines, a heavy arrow pointing downward, and a cluster of crosshatch marks, as if to block in an area. In one corner, a stair-like symbol ran flush with the base of the L. The pencil was lighter there, like it had been rubbed or partly erased in haste. To anyone else, it might have looked like a kid's idle doodle. To Ethan, every line stirred memories of rough maps passed in the field, maps where a few strokes could mark the thin edge between life and death. He looked up, instincts kicking in, scanning the room. Everyone was where they'd been. The man with the lunchbox still slumped, the young mother still rocking her child in small arcs, the night clerk still propped on one hand. But down the hall, the side door hung open a crack, its hinge giving a thin squeal as the wind slid through. A stripe of yellow light from the hall bulb cut across the tile floor like the edge of a knife. And in that sliver of time, a small figure slipped past the gap. Just a flicker of form. Not enough to catch color or detail, but the size was wrong for an adult. The shape vanished into the outside dark, followed by the door tapping its frame in the wind, shivering once before holding still. Ethan kept the paper in his palm, not tucking it away yet. His fingers closed loosely around it, the creases pressing into his skin. He knew if he didn't move now, the trail could dissolve like breath on glass. But he also knew that in a space this quiet, every hurried step would echo. He needed that shadow within reach for as long as possible, even if it was already gone. He rose, walking slowly along the row of seats, eyes fixed on the side door. His boots tapped against the tile, blending with the heater's low hum. Closer, the cold air spilling in through the crack carried the damp smell of night, and a faint rot from garbage left too long. His fingers brushed the metal edge, cold enough to bite. The door wasn't locked. The loose hinge let it swing wider when he pushed. Outside was a narrow concrete run, brick walls on either side, their surfaces stained and dark. The lights here were few and weak, a couple burned out, leaving ragged pockets of shadow. Wind coiled in the passage, stirring plastic bags and paper scraps. On the ground, a few long, wet streaks, maybe from last night's rain, maybe from a leaking drain, caught the dim light like shards of cracked mirror. Ethan stepped out fully, eyes working the shadows. No footsteps, no quickened breathing, just the wind scraping past the wall's edge. He moved a few steps further, stopping at a bend in the alley. Left led to the parking lot, empty. Right was a row of industrial trash bins packed tight together, no space for anyone to hide. He listened, but beyond the faint tremor of a flickering light at the alley's end, nothing answered. Turning back, he stood in the doorway, looking into the station. It looked exactly as it had minutes ago. Maybe, to everyone else, nothing had happened. But in his hand, the paper seemed warmer now, partly from skin heat, partly from the weight of what he understood. Someone, a kid with small, shaking hands, had chosen him for this. Not the clerk, not the mother, not the man with the lunchbox. Him. He folded the note again, this time flat, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest. That way, every beat of his heart would remind him it was there. Back in his seat, he leaned toward the wall, eyes on the side door, though he knew the shadow was long gone. Not waiting for it to return, but locking the scene in memory. The door ajar, the knife-edge stripe of light, and the figure slipping into the alley. An unspoken signal, starting something he didn't yet have a name for. The loudspeaker cracked on, announcing another bus, not his. The voice was flat, repeating the details, then clicked off. The waiting room settled back into its old stillness. But for Ethan, it wasn't the same. The note in his pocket was like a small core, quietly radiating its pull, turning his thoughts and muscles toward it. He didn't know yet where it would lead, but one thing was certain. He couldn't pretend he hadn't received it. His eyes dropped to the coffee cup, stone cold now, a thin water ring left behind. He took it up, drained the last sip, the bitterness reminding him that clarity often came from what didn't go down easy. Setting it aside, he pulled his pack closer, the strap groaning under the shift. He sat still, but inside, he was already set, ready to move at the next sign. At the end of the hall, the side door had shut fully. No light, no draft, just a clean black line, as if it had never been opened. But Ethan knew better. Once a door opens, even for a second, it never truly closes in your mind. From here on, Every sound and shadow in this station would read like the slanted, shaky handwriting on that paper still resting against his heart. The glass door of the police station opened with a dry ting from the small bell overhead, the sound carrying through the hollow stillness inside. The air held a blend of old coffee, damp paper, and the faint bite of printer ink, a smell particular to places that sit overnight without much company. Ethan stepped in, his boots bringing a trace of damp grit from the walkway outside, each step leaving a faint gray mark on the worn square tiles. The duty room held just one man, Sheriff Dalton, seated behind a heavy wooden desk, its surface cross-hatched with years of scratches. A desk lamp cast a dull amber circle over a scatter of papers and a cloudy white coffee cup, the surface still speckled with tiny bubbles. He stirred with a metal spoon, the clink steady as a clock. His gray hair was combed neat, his back straight but not stiff, the posture of someone long used to slow mornings with few surprises. Ethan stepped closer, pulled the note from his inside pocket, and set it lightly on the desk, cornered toward Dalton. "This," he said, short and quiet, just enough to keep the word from carrying across the room. Dalton glanced down, eyes lingering only long enough to catch a few words. He lifted the paper, unfolded it with one hand, the other still finishing the last loop of his spoon in the coffee. Dalton's gaze passed over the line. "Please help my friend, being kept," and the crude map beneath. No change in his face. He folded it in half, set it beside the cup, just close enough for the corner to dampen in a rising steam. Then he shrugged, the gesture closing a conversation that hadn't started or brushing it off as one of a dozen things that could be left alone. "Could be a prank for one of the station kids," he said, tone flat, no edge of concern. The last word thinned into a sigh, like a man who'd learned most strange notes lead nowhere. Ethan stayed put, eyes fixed on the paper like it was the only proof of something no one else could see. He noticed the way Dalton had placed it. Not careless exactly, but far from the handling you'd give something important. The corner sagged over the desk's edge, trembling when the spoon left the cup. Outside, a pickup rumbled past, engine note filtering through the cracked window. Cold air carried the scent of stale coffee into the room. Ethan breathed it in, feeling the bitterness from his bus station cup still clinging to his tongue. Coupled with the indifference in front of him, the muscles at the back of his neck warmed like someone had set a hand there. Dalton leaned back, arms folded, leaving the note there like a scrap not yet tossed in the bin. "Bus station," he repeated, eyes turned to the window, always as little things like that. He didn't look at Ethan, and that made the words feel even more like a period. Ethan let a few seconds pass, weighing the space between walking out and sitting down to explain. Each second, the wall clock ticked louder, steady, neither rushing nor letting the silence stretch forever. He glanced at the note again, shaky handwriting, rough sketch, then met Dalton's indifferent gaze for a heartbeat. The soldier's memory kicked in. The feeling of reporting something you knew was true to someone who didn't believe. Part of him wanted to rap his knuckles on the desk, force the man to look closer. Another part knew that if he pushed too hard, every door would slam shut. In the moment, he chose to keep his voice level, though a tightness in it still gave him away. "You can keep it," he said, nodding toward the note. Dalton looked up, shrugged again, the kind of shrug that came from years of filing things into the not-worth-it drawer. "I'll log it," he said, and reached for a pen, flipping open a thin ledger to a blank page. Ethan didn't move as Dalton's pen scratched out a few words he couldn't read from where he stood. The pen clinked against the coffee cup when he set it down, making the liquid tremble. Dalton slid the note back, his fingertip brushing the crease as if signaling the exchange was over. No extra questions, no promise to check further. Outside, the first light stretched the window's shadow across the far wall. In that new glow, the lines around Dalton's eyes and mouth stood out. Creases not from smiles, but from years of choosing the easiest way forward. Ethan understood that if he left the note here, it would vanish into a drawer never opened again. He picked it up, folded it clean, slid it back into his jacket pocket. Dalton didn't stop him, only lifted his coffee for a sip, eyes already on the computer screen. Ethan turned toward the door, his steps on the tile echoing like when he'd entered, but now with a sharper, surer beat. At the door, he didn't look back, but he knew Dalton would remember him, not for the note, but for the look when he took it back. The look of someone who wasn't going to let it drop. Out in the cold morning air, the weight of the paper against his chest pulsed like its own heartbeat, pushing him faster down the steps. His hand closed around it, the rough edge of the crease scraping his skin. He had tried, slowly, plainly, to explain to Dalton the handwriting, the folds, the map, and everything he'd learned in uniform about distress signals. This wasn't the kind of thing a bored kid scrawled for a joke. But Dalton's face hadn't changed. Eyes half-lidded, brows lifting only slightly as if counting the minutes left in his shift. The pen had barely touched the logbook before the sheriff snapped it shut with a dry thump. He slid it aside like ticking a box, just enough to keep from being accused of ignoring it outright. When he handed the paper back, his finger rested on it for one deliberate beat before pulling away. Don't let the past make you see what isn't there. The words weren't loud, but they dropped into the space between them like a stone into a well. No sarcasm, just the dull scent of a worn-out piece of advice, a thing people said when they wanted a story to end, not to be heard. Ethan stood for another second, eyes dropping to the mottled tile floor between their shoes. The words had lodged in his chest like a splinter, small, but enough to catch with every breath. He turned without replying, letting the sound of his footsteps carry louder than needed across the empty room. The glass door closed behind him, the bell giving a thin ring that the street wind swallowed whole. Outside was colder than he'd expected. Morning light hadn't yet burned off the damp from the night, leaving beads of water scattered across the street. He stood on the steps, let out a long breath, and watched it vanish quickly into the air. In his jacket pocket, the note now felt like part of his body, something carried like an order he couldn't ignore. He walked the town's main street, still as if everyone was trying to steal a few more minutes of sleep before the day began. Windows drawn with heavy curtains, signs with faded paint, park benches still wet. From an alley, the smell of early toast and wood smoke drifted out, tugging up memories of winter mornings in his mother's small kitchen, the AM radio playing country music. The memory, instead of warming him, only sharpened the urge to keep something intact, something that, once lost, would be gone for good. He thought about the patrols overseas, when the smallest sign, a wisp of smoke, a strip of white cloth, a flicker-fast gesture, had saved an entire unit. And he knew the tremor in that handwriting wasn't a prank. Dalton could dismiss it, but to him, every detail was a thread leading to a real person, somewhere in the dark. Ethan stopped at an old convenience store, its neon light casting a cold white glow inside. He went in, bought a bottle of water and a pack of peppermint hard candy. The cashier, a boy not yet 20, asked only, "Need a bag?" On the sidewalk, Ethan paused, opened the note again. The faint pencil lines still clearly showed the L shape of a building, an arrow pointing down. He traced the drawing with a fingertip, like following a map to something valuable and dangerous. Morning wind carried the low blare of a truck horn from far off, a dull background hum. Ethan slipped the note back into his inside pocket, this time close to his heart, and pulled the jacket zipper higher. His steps shifted direction, not back to the bus station, not straight home. He needed to know how many buildings in this town matched that drawing, and who was desperate or brave enough to send such a signal to a stranger. Turning onto a narrow street heading south, he noticed his hand still lightly gripping the folded edge of the paper through the fabric, as if it might vanish if he let go. Dalton's words still lingered in the back of his head. Don't let the past make you see what isn't there. But with each step they were drowned out by something stronger, steadier. The thump of his own heartbeat, and the pull to find the truth, even if it led him back into the darkness he thought he'd left behind. The old pickup shuddered each time he pushed the gas over water-filled potholes, the engine groaning as if complaining about the miles ahead. The smell of burned plastic mixed with old seat fabric clung to the cab, forcing him to roll the window down for a cut of cold air. The road outside left smooth asphalt for loose, jagged gravel, stones pinging off the undercarriage. From his jacket pocket, he pulled the drawing, spread it on the steering wheel as he idled by the roadside, matching each line to the faint outline ahead. The L-shaped mark on paper lined up uncannily with a rusted tin roof structure in the distance. The arrow pointing to a basement wasn't just a mark now. It was a reminder that under that silent shell, someone could be waiting. He turned the key, rolled forward. Weeds on either side of the track rose past his knees, lashing the sides of the truck in the wind like hands trying to turn him back. Dry branches hissed in the gusts, snapping against the windows like warnings. But he didn't slow. Inside the cab, his pulse beat in time with the engine, quick but deliberate, each turn of the pistons a step closer to an answer. At the edge of the site, the barbed wire fence was rotted, sections fallen away, leaving just enough space for a vehicle to squeeze through. He cut the engine before the tires touched the cracked concrete inside. Silence fell hard, broken only by the wind whistling through the empty window frames of abandoned buildings. Ethan stepped out, pulled his hood lower, his hand unconsciously checking the folding knife in his pocket. Not to threaten, but out of the habit of someone who'd walked into places where a small mistake could cost blood. He followed a narrow track along the wall, scanning each black window, each long shadow on the ground. The air was thick with mold, rust, and bird droppings, the taste of metal on every breath. The building from the drawing came into full view as he rounded a corner. L-shaped, its roof sagged, the pale blue paint peeling off in wide flakes. A steel door stood ajar, the hinge giving a faint cry in the wind. He froze, eyes dropping to the ground before it. Small shoe prints mixed with larger ones, fresh and deep in the wet mud. He crouched, touched one of the small prints, cold as ice, and felt a mix of relief and a fierce need to protect. Relief because the signal hadn't been an illusion. It had led to something real, to real signs. But also urgency, a reminder that if he'd found this place, the one who'd sent the signal might be in deeper trouble. He slipped through the gap, stepping into the dark thick with dust and rotting wood. Light leaked through cracks high in the wall, cutting across the room in sharp beams where dust hung like fog. Each step echoed, carrying the drip of water from somewhere above onto the concrete floor. His hand slid along the wall, searching for the stairs, just where the arrow in the drawing had pointed. The staircase was metal, rusted, the railing cold and damp, each step groaning under his weight. Cold air rose from below, raising goose flesh along his arms. On the fourth step, he stopped, crouched low to listen. The basement seemed to swallow every sound, holding only a faint, far-off clink, like chains brushing together in a slow, light wind. He touched the pocket again, the edge of the paper like a promise, a responsibility. From the moment he'd received it, everything he did was no longer just curiosity or duty. It was an unspoken commitment. If someone was here, he would find them and bring them back. Ethan kept moving down, his eyes adjusting to the dark. The basement emerged with yellow-stained concrete walls, pipes twisting overhead, and several metal doors shut tight. The damp smell was stronger now, mixed with something else, the stale scent of a person, of breath held too long. He knew he was getting close. And this time, there was no Dalton, no one to block him or doubt him. Just him, and a resolve that had taken root the moment his hand touched those small footprints outside. He paused at the threshold, drawing in a long breath, letting the damp mix with the taste of rust until it settled into his senses. It was a familiar smell, the kind he'd known in abandoned warehouses and war zones, the scent of time left to rot, of stories never told. But here, in the middle of a quiet American town, it carried something else. Unease, threaded with the sense that someone had tried to erase what happened here, and failed. Light from a broken window spilled in thin streaks across the concrete floor, just enough to reveal something that slowed his pulse. A scrap of pale gray fabric, stiff with dried blood, caught in a rusted door latch. He crouched, gloved fingers brushing the edge. Hardened long ago, it felt like a silent message about what had happened. Not an accident, not a child's game, a mark of force. He lifted his gaze, scanning the floor. In the thick dust, footprints stood out, small, round, the heels and toes pressed deep as if the walker had run or been dragged. The size made his skin tighten, too small for any adult, smaller even than most elementary school kids. A few overlapped, their direction jumbled, then gathered into a darker trail, leading straight to the stairs that went farther down. Ethan followed them, each step careful but firm. The silence here wasn't the hollow kind. It had weight, as if every surface was waiting for a sound to answer back. Under his boots, dust and brittle debris gave a faint crunch that, in this space, sounded like pebbles dropping into deep water. Near the stairs, he caught a faint sound, metal rattling, or maybe a distant door shutting. He stopped, letting his ears settle into the background. Everything went still, leaving only the sound of his heartbeat and the breath that rose and vanished like smoke. He set his hand on the icy railing, eyes still sweeping the room. Then, from above, a flicker of movement snapped his head around. In a doorway on the second floor, a dark shape slid past, fast enough to blur, too quick to tell if it was a person or just the shadow of a tree outside. But his experience told him it wasn't a trick of light. The way it moved, low, quick, precise, belonged to someone who didn't want to be seen, but had to watch who was coming in. Ethan stayed still, letting the silence stretch like a game of patience. He knew sometimes you didn't have to chase. Just staying long enough could make someone slip. But here, with children's prints leading down and someone hiding above, he had to choose. And his choice was clear. The weakest always came first. He turned back toward the stairs, but his eyes swept the shadows upstairs, marking the doorway, the layout of the hall, every possible exit. In his mind, the building's map began to form, its lines built from the crude drawing and what he'd just seen. He took the first step down, his hands sliding over the railing, feeling flakes of rust turn to red dust on his glove. The smell of metal and mildew grew thicker, as if each step pulled him deeper into somewhere cut off in the outside world. The darkness below wasn't just the absence of light. It was a weight, swallowing the last scraps that slipped through the crack above. Before he disappeared completely from the upstairs view, he stopped, tilting his head as though listening. In truth, it was a silent message. He knew someone was there, and he would be back. Nothing could change that. In the basement, the only light came from the small flashlight he pulled from his jacket. The beam swept over yellowed concrete, glinting off shallow puddles scattered on the floor. The small footprints vanished at the base of the stairs, replaced by long streaks, marks of being dragged. He crouched, touched the bare cement where the dust had been wiped away. It was cold, empty, a reminder that time was running faster than he wanted. Somewhere above, a faint creak broke the air, like weight shifting toward the stairwell. But when he looked up, the dark at the top was unchanged. Whoever had been there, if they'd been there at all, was gone. He knew he'd have to work both directions, deeper to reach whoever needed him, and ready for the one who'd been watching from above. Ethan gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling slightly on the wall, mirroring the steady rise of resolve in his chest. The initial spark of relief at finding real traces had hardened into something else, a need to protect, fierce and non-negotiable. And he knew, to protect, you had to be ready to stand your ground. Strings of market lights hung above wet pavement, turning puddles into broken mirrors reflecting gold, red, and pale green. The scent of roasted corn and funnel cakes drifted through thin charcoal smoke, warm but unable to chase away the cold creeping up from the damp ground. Ethan moved through the crowd, his eyes sweeping over each face, each figure bent toward the makeshift stalls. He'd learned to search like this, unhurried, unshowy, but locked onto the details that didn't belong. Then he saw it, a messy, dark tuft of hair, standing out against the wash of yellow light. The boy was curled up under the vegetable stall's table, somewhere adults rarely looked, knees drawn tight to his chest, arms wrapped around them, but his eyes, set deep, glowing like a lamp behind fog glass, still searched the gap between the table legs. They swept over the crowd as if looking for, or waiting for, someone, and when those eyes found him, they stopped. It felt like the whole night market slowed. All the calls from vendors, the shuffle of footsteps, the murmur of bargaining faded to the edges. What was left was the space between him and those eyes. It wasn't the startled look of a kid caught hiding, but the measured look of someone weighing whether the person across from him could be trusted. Ethan didn't move in right away. He knew, moments like this shattered if you rushed them. Instead, he shifted to the side, pretending to glance over the stall opposite, where a middle-aged woman was stacking bunches of scallions still wet from the rain. But in his peripheral vision, the boy stayed put. A light wind lifted the edge of the tarp above the stall, showing more of the shadow where the boy sat. His cheeks were hollow, and a stain spread across the collar of a worn sweater. Not the kind of dirt from a day outside, but the build-up from days without a real place to stay. Ethan edged left, slow, like he was just finding a way around the stall. When he was only a few yards away, the boy tilted his head, like a signal rehearsed in advance, wary, guarded, but not fully closed off. He stopped beside a stack of plastic crates, crouching as if to look at vegetables, bringing his eyes level with the boy's. Neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence Ethan knew well from combat, both sides weighing whether to lower their weapons. Then the boy inched forward, slipping a tiny hand out of the shadow to place something at the table's edge. A folded scrap of paper, edges worn. Ethan didn't grab it right away. He looked at the boy first, making sure this was what he meant to give. The boy's eyes flickered once, enough for him to know. When Ethan reached out, the boy's fingers withdrew just as fast. The small shape sank deeper into the dark under the table, gone from sight. He unfolded the paper. Under the yellow light, pencil lines emerged. Another map, more detailed than the first. This time, It didn't just show the L-shaped building. It had arrows for entry points, marked for locked doors, and a small square marked X, maybe the basement room's location. He looked up, searching for the boy again, but the space under the table was empty now. The vegetable seller bent to pick up a fallen bunch of greens, her face unreadable. In the tide of market traffic, there was no sign of him. But Ethan didn't feel loss. What the boy had left mattered more than his presence. The precision of the map was proof. Ethan's suspicions were real, and at least one other person wanted the truth to come out. He folded the paper, slid it deep into his inside pocket. The market's glow, the smell of charcoal smoke, the music drifting from a fried food stall, all just a cover. Underneath, the hunt had shifted into a new chapter, a small pulse of relief, knowing the boy was alive, mixed with a rising pull to protect. This wasn't about a paper slipped into his pocket at a bus depot anymore. This was responsibility. From the moment he took the map, the road ahead would have to be walked to its end, whatever it cost. The yellow lights still glossed the wet pavement like oil, but the moment between Ethan and the boy, now he knew his name was Mason, existed in its own pocket of time. Mason didn't speak when Ethan crouched near him. He just stood at the edge of a stall selling old toys, turning a broken toy truck in his fingers, head bent so his messy hair hid most of his face, lips pressed tight. When Ethan mentioned the paper, Mason lifted his head slowly. No surprise, no confusion, just a faint nod, like the two of them had signed an invisible contract. His voice, when it came, was so low Ethan had to lean in. Short sentences, broken by quick breaths. More kids in the basement, none allowed out. Each word dropped like a stone into still water, the ripples spreading far in Ethan's mind. From his pocket, Mason pulled a piece of cardboard torn from a shipping box, a corner still sticky with tape. The dull pencil scratched softly as he drew, barely audible over the market's noise. The map took shape, again the L-shaped building, but more detailed than either of the previous ones. He marked each hallway, each doorway, and dotted the corners with small circles, security cameras. On the right wall, he drew a square with a bold arrow leading out. An exit, maybe the only one unlocked. When he was nearly done, Mason paused, glanced around, then tipped the cardboard to one side and added something along the edge, 3 blocky letters, Haven. Beside them, he sketched the outline of a brick, as if to show the word was carved or written somewhere inside. Ethan didn't ask what Haven meant. Kids remembered what mattered. There would be a reason. The name would surface again, maybe as the key. He just studied the map, committing every distance, every camera angle, every blind spot to memory. Mason folded the piece of cardboard in half, but instead of handing it straight to Ethan, he kept it in his hand, eyes scanning slowly. It felt like he was making one last calculation, whether this man could truly be trusted. Ethan didn't look away. He let the gaze hold, let Mason see that there was nothing in his eyes except certainty. Not the loud kind of promise, but the quiet kind, the sort of commitment only someone who's had to keep another person alive can understand. Finally, Mason extended the cardboard. When Ethan took it, the boy's fingers pulled back quickly, as if he'd just given away a part of himself. Without another word, Mason turned and slipped into the flow of the night market, his small frame shrinking and then disappearing entirely behind a stall selling second-hand jackets. Ethan stood still, the folded cardboard in his hand, feeling the faint warmth left from the boy's fingers. Around him, the noise of vendors calling and laughter washed back in. But in his mind, every pencil stroke on that scrap stood out as if freshly carved. He could see the damp, cold basement, the small figures sitting close together, the unblinking eyes of security cameras. And on one stretch of brick wall, the word Haven seemed to glow in the dark, a word that sounded like shelter, but sat in the middle of captivity. He slipped the cardboard into his inside pocket and zipped it shut. The weight in his chest felt heavier now, but also more defined. This was no longer suspicion or gut feeling. He had information, a target, a trail to follow. There was a flash of relief knowing the boy was still free, at least in some sense, but it was immediately bound to a harder thing. Protection, solid and unshakable. Ethan knew exactly what waited ahead. Danger, resistance, and doors locked by more than just metal. But he also knew this. Since the moment Mason gave that small confirming nod, he no longer had the option of staying out of it. On his way out of the market, the night wind rolled in from the river, cold and carrying the smell of old rain mixed with frying oil. Ethan turned his collar up and walked faster. Each step seemed to pack more weight into the decision he'd just made. He had a map, he had a target, and in his chest, the soldier's heartbeat had returned, the same one that had carried him through battlefields, now leading him toward a different kind of basement, where darkness wasn't just the absence of light. The night wind hissed through the crack of the door in short bursts, blending with the creak of old floorboards underfoot. The wooden house sat tucked between tall pines, its sloped roof silvered by years of weather, the smell of resin and mildew woven into the air. Ethan shut the door, hearing the wooden latch drop into place, a fragile sort of assurance. In the kitchen, a single bare bulb hung low, throwing uneven yellow light over scratched wooden walls. Mason sat on a low chair, back slightly hunched, holding a bowl of hot soup Ethan had reheated on the oil stove. Steam drifted upward, catching in his messy hair, scattering light in tiny beads. He kept his head down, spooning small mouthfuls, the faint clink of metal on ceramic marking the quiet rhythm in the room. Ethan stood by the sink, screwing the cap onto a water bottle, eyes still on the boy. The scene pulled up memories of mess hall meals in camp. People eating quick, quiet, every movement betraying the tension of days when no one knew what would happen next. Mason ate slowly, but his eyes flicked now and then toward the dark window, as if checking something outside. On the kitchen table, next to his bowl, lay the cardboard map of the L-shaped building. Ethan had placed it there, open under the light, so they could look at it while they ate. He knew kids remembered better when they looked while they talked. From time to time, Mason set his spoon down to point at a corner of the map, muttering a few words: hallways, cameras, a stairwell with a flickering light. Ethan didn't take written notes. He let it burn straight into memory, the same way he'd learned battle maps. Outside, the pine trees whispered like a long, low breath. The house belonged to an old friend from the service, now living elsewhere, leaving it to the wind and time. His friend had lent him the key without questions, just said, "If you need it, use it." Ethan valued that silence. Some things were safest when no one knew the details. Mason stopped halfway through the soup, hugging the bowl to his chest for warmth. He hadn't taken off his coat, the worn fabric still damp with night mist. Ethan reached into a cupboard for a wool blanket and draped it over his shoulders. No words, just warmth spreading through the fibers. For a brief moment, Ethan felt an unnameable joy, not because he was closer to rescuing the other kids, but because Mason was here, safe, at least for tonight. But the joy carried an undertow, the need to protect. It came in like a tide, making it impossible to stop at just getting this boy to safety. The basement, the small footprints on the concrete floor, the word Haven on the wall, all of it was so vivid he almost felt he was already there. Ethan returned to the table, sat opposite Mason, and nudged the bowl toward him with a small nod. "Eat." The boy obeyed, and they finished the meal in silence, broken only by the wind curling under the eaves and the clink of metal on ceramic. On the wall, their shadows overlapped, trembling slightly with the sway of the lamp in the wind. When Mason set the spoon down for the last time, Ethan cleared the bowl, washed it, and set it upside down to dry. Ordinary motions, but in his mind they were like the small pre-mission steps. Every gap filled, every loose end tied, so nothing would be left to chance when the time came. Before heading upstairs, Ethan paused at the window. Darkness spread thick outside, broken only by a few faraway lights in town. He knew this house was quiet enough for Mason's sleep tonight, but it couldn't be a long-term shelter. The word Haven on the map pressed at him, reminding him this brief peace was only worth something if he could keep it, and keep the other children still trapped. He pulled the heavy curtain shut, the fabric's rasp like closing a temporary chapter. Turning off all but the dim kitchen light, he climbed the wooden stairs, each step sounding soft in the stillness, still enough to hear leaves dropping outside. Upstairs, Mason was curled under the blanket, breathing evenly. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of his own heartbeat, the rhythm of a man who'd chosen a road with no turning back. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, joy would give way to action. And from this moment on, every step he took would be toward protection. The worn wooden table in the old living room was the only bright spot in the house when Claire opened her laptop. The pale blue glow lit the wood grain, and her face, hair pulled back, glasses slipping low on her nose. Ethan sat opposite, elbows on the table, eyes locked on the folders that appeared. Claire hadn't just brought the laptop. She brought a thick black external hard drive, wrapped in a padded case. She plugged it in, the faint chime sounding as the data came alive. The folder Mason had left was only lightly encrypted, but inside was a trove of images and spreadsheets, enough to make Ethan's stomach turn cold. Phone photos, blurry but clear enough to recognize. Dark hallways, damp concrete walls, metal doors with electronic locks. A few frames showed metal bunk beds, thin gray blankets, and small figures perched on the edges. Claire zoomed in, circling odd details. The tiny logo printed on the blankets, on the bed frames, even on a placard by a door. Haven Shelter Initiative. Ethan remembered the word Mason had drawn. Now it wasn't some vague symbol. Claire opened the logs folder, Excel sheets with dates, ID numbers, and locations. The headers read, Transit, Intake, Exit. Scanning quickly, she saw the codes matched legal shelter facilities across several states. But the strange thing was the exit column. It listed locations that matched no government registry. Outside, the wind cut through the trees, branches rasping the roof. In the room, there was only the sound of Claire's typing and Ethan's pen scratching over paper. He copied down the strange addresses, overlaying them in his mind on Mason's map. The points formed an arc, with the L-shaped building in the suburb's dead center. Claire looked up, eyes sharpening. They're moving the kids. Ethan didn't answer, but his fist tightened. He'd seen routes like this before. Overseas, they were used to move aid shipments or evacuate the wounded. But this wasn't cargo, and it wasn't grown adults making their own choices. These were children. Mason had risked everything to get these files. In one video folder, Claire opened a short, shaky clip, blurry, but still catching the sound of a metal door slamming and hurried footsteps. A tall figure in a long coat flashed across the frame, carrying a heavy canvas bag. The corner of a plastic container labeled medical supplies jutting out. Claire froze the frame, zoomed in, and pointed to the Faint Haven logo stamped into the bag. Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. These people didn't just keep the children. They controlled the supply of medicine and food. He knew that when someone held both the living space and the essential needs of a group, they could do anything they wanted. Claire pulled a thin folder from her bag, notes and photocopies of old articles about the Haven Shelter Initiative. On paper, the name showed up in sponsorship announcements and community events, with photos of board members shaking hands with politicians. But in the margins, Claire had circled in red the cases of missing children that were never resolved. The pattern was the same. Every child had no official guardian. They sat for hours, piecing the fragments together. On the table, between cups of cold coffee and piles of papers, a clearer picture began to take shape, a network of movement hidden beneath the mask of charity. Ethan looked at Claire and realized she carried the same look he had now. No more doubt, only the questions of when and how to stop it. The clock's ticking seemed slower. Mason slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his small hands clutching a corner of the fabric. Light from the laptop screen swept across his face, revealing the dark circles under his eyes. Ethan knew that every minute they spent here analyzing meant another minute those kids were still in some basement somewhere. But he also knew going in unprepared meant never coming back. Claire slid the hard drive into a shockproof case, her gaze like a seal of commitment. Ethan stood, stretched, feeling muscles long and used tighten. In the thick air, tinged with paper, coffee, and the night's cold, he felt one thing clearly. The brief relief of having Mason safe tonight had already turned into another drive, to protect them all, not just one. And that drive would take him straight into the place every instinct told him to avoid. He gathered the papers, folded Mason's hand-drawn map, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Claire stood by the door, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't for lack of words, but because anything said would be carried off by the wind, while action was the only thing that mattered now. Headlights cut across the front yard like a blade of light, slicing through the thick darkness. In that moment, Ethan saw a figure, tall, thin, a cap pulled low over the eyes, standing motionless by the rotting wooden fence. No movement, no voice, just a heavy presence, like an exclamation mark dropped into the quiet. The night wind carried dampness, pushing the smell of wet soil through the cracks of the door. Slow, deliberate steps crunched over the gravel outside, the pace unhurried, but with no sign of leaving. Ethan stood behind the thin curtain, his breath moving the fabric just enough to stir. His eyes never left the figure, while his mind quietly ran through every possible entry point, every gap someone could slip through. Claire stepped out from the kitchen, but before she could speak, Ethan held up his hand for silence. Mason was still sleeping soundly on the couch, breathing evenly, though his brows pinched slightly, as if distant sound were slipping into his dream. The weak yellow light from the table lamp lit only a small patch, leaving most of the room in shadow. The man outside tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Then the headlights went out, leaving only the weight of the night. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a dense silence that seemed to still everything inside. Ethan could hear the beat of his own heart, loud in his ears. He moved quietly to the table, opened a drawer, and took out a worn army folding knife. Not to use immediately, but to remind himself he still had options. Claire pressed her back to the wall, eyes fixed on the window, holding her laptop bag as if it were living proof. Suddenly, there was a light knock, not at the front, but at the back door, the one leading to the overgrown yard. 3 taps, evenly spaced, too deliberate to be the wind. Ethan looked at Claire, and both understood. They were surrounded, or at least being watched from more than one side. He switched off the table lamp, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The old wooden house seemed to breathe with them, each creak in the floorboards amplified. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall, turning into a scatter of tiny bright spots on the wet ground. Rain had been his companion through many nights in the army, but tonight it only made the sounds outside easier to blend. Ethan edged toward the back door, pressing his ear against it. No more knocking, just the sound of water dripping from the eaves onto something metallic. He cracked the door open just enough to see a small box on the threshold, a strip of silver duct tape across the top. No one in sight. Claire came closer, whispering, could be a warning or a trap. Ethan nodded, slicing the tape with his knife. Inside was a stack of grainy printed photos, each taken from above, him and Mason entering the house, Claire opening her laptop, even a shot of them leaning close over the map. Whoever it was had been close enough to capture everything while they thought they were safe. The last photo was different, a metal door painted blue with a scrawled note underneath. Time is running out. Ethan gripped the edge of the photo, the damp paper cold against his skin. They spread the photos out on the table, studying each detail. The angle, the height, the light, all showed a fixed camera, not handheld. That meant there had been surveillance equipment set up here before. Someone had known they'd come, or guessed right. Outside, an engine started quietly and faded into the distance, leaving the yard empty. The faint glow from a street lamp hundreds of yards away filtered through the trees, but it wasn't enough to shake the sense of being watched. Mason shifted in his sleep, pulling the blanket to his chin. Ethan looked at the boy, then at Claire. Their eyes met, both knowing the next step would go far beyond just gathering information. The rain came down harder, drumming on the tin roof and windows like a steady count. Ethan took a slow breath, catching the damp wood smell mixed with the stale bite of cold coffee. His years in the service had taught him that an enemy didn't always need to show up to take control. Sometimes all it took was planting the idea that every move you made was already being watched. That night, no one in the house got any more sleep. Claire packed up the gear, backing the files up 3 different ways. Ethan sat in the wooden chair by the window, eyes locked on the dark patch of yard where that figure had stood. In the stillness, he thought about the words on the back of that last photo. Time is running out. It wasn't just a warning. It was an appointment, and it meant he had to get there sooner than he'd planned. He leaned down, resting a hand lightly on Mason's shoulder so the boy would know he was right there. Their breath rose in thin clouds, vanishing into the streaks of mist sliding past the tree trunks. Ethan opened the back door slow, the hinge letting out a small groan that was enough to make them both pause and listen. No footsteps coming after them, no beam of light cutting through the dark, just the forest wind carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. The narrow path behind the house bled into a trail between stands of birch. A half-moon hung over the canopy, flashing now and then when thin clouds drifted past. Ethan moved fast, but kept Mason tucked in close, his hand never leaving the boy's thin shoulder. Every crunch of dry leaves underfoot felt like a signal that could draw out whoever they were hiding from. The abandoned bunker was about half a mile out, a place Ethan had scouted back when he was with the National Guard. He knew it had a back entrance, mostly hidden by vines and loose rock, tight enough that a stranger could walk past without noticing. As they got close, Mason looked back, fear from the night before still in his eyes, but with it, a strange flicker of trust for this man. Ethan dropped to a knee, pulling the vines aside to uncover a rusted steel door. He shoved it open, the hinges screamed, and a wave of cold air rolled out, thick with the smell of metal and damp stone. They stepped inside, leaving the door almost closed behind them. It was pitch dark, but Ethan remembered the layout. 3 steps left, down a narrow hall, to a small room with an old wooden table and a single bare bulb light that would still work if hooked up to a battery. Claire was already there, sitting at the table, laptop screen glowing like the only window to the outside world. Ethan handed over everything. The portable drive, the printouts, the hand-drawn map Mason had made. Claire plugged in right away, her fingers moving quick across the keys. Every keystroke echoed twice in the bunker, mixing with the slow drip of water from the stone ceiling. "Keep the door," she said softly, eyes never leaving the screen. Ethan nodded, pulling the folding knife from his pocket and taking a post near the entrance. Mason sat in the wooden chair by the table, knees drawn up, eyes still flicking toward the dark of the hallway. He didn't say a word, but his silence pressed on Ethan like the weight of a clock he couldn't stop. Claire got a secure line, and her voice dropped as she spoke into her headset. "There are a lot of image files, movement logs, clear signs of unlawful detention. The Haven logo shows up over and over." Ethan caught bits of it, knowing she was talking to an FBI agent she'd worked with before. "We'll have a team there right away," came the voice from her laptop speaker, like a cord tying them into something much bigger. When Claire closed the laptop, an engine rumbled somewhere out in the woods. At first it was far off, then closer, then slowing down. Ethan signaled for silence and stepped toward the vent near the floor to listen. There were at least 2 vehicles. Their engines sounded different, and the crunch of gravel told him they'd turned down the trail. He motioned for Claire to power down everything. The light vanished, plunging the bunker into complete darkness. The engines cut off. Doors opened. Voices carried in, too faint to make out the words, but enough to know they were looking for something or someone. In the dark, Mason's small hand clamped onto Ethan's, fingers ice cold. Ethan gently pried it loose and held it in his own palm, a quiet reassurance. 15 heavy minutes passed. Footsteps crunched on dry twigs from more than one direction. At one point, a flashlight beam swept across the iron door, quick and deliberate, then was gone. Ethan kept his breathing slow, his back pressed to the cold wall. Finally, the engine started again. Tires ground over gravel and dry leaves, fading away. The wind reclaimed the forest, but this time it carried the lingering bite of gasoline. Ethan didn't relax, not right away. He waited a few more minutes, listening hard until he was sure they were gone. Claire reopened the laptop, the faint glow returning. "FBI says we need to keep the witness safe, at least until morning," she said. Ethan nodded, knowing the night was far from over. Mason leaned against the wall, eyelids heavy but not daring to fall fully asleep. Outside, rain began to fall, blending with the sound of leaves and masking other noises that might signal trouble. But Ethan knew, rain didn't hide the fact they'd stepped into a place the other side didn't want anyone touching. From here on, turning back wasn't an option. The sun hadn't cleared the tree line yet, but silver-gray light seeped through the bunker's gaps. Ethan stood by the wooden table, hands around a cold cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the maps spread out before him. Claire sat across from him, laptop open to a secure FBI feed. On the screen, stern faces in a command room appeared in small squares, with satellite images of an L-shaped building in between. One agent pointed to the screen, his voice even and clipped. "The red circles are camera locations. We'll disable them in this order." His finger traced a thin red line connecting the dots, exactly the spots Mason had described the night before. The boy stood behind Ethan, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the map, as if afraid to miss a single detail. Ethan leaned in, penciling notes on the terrain, where a fence had collapsed, where the grass grew high enough to hide in. "Here," he said, pointing to a small square behind the building, "is the emergency exit, but it's locked from the inside. We'll need a key." Mason nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "The key's in the manager's office, ground floor, next to the stairs to the basement." The plan was broken into steps. One team would approach from the west, using the gap between 2 warehouses to slip in. The other would come from the east, cut the power, then take out the cameras. Ethan was assigned to the second group, not to fight, but to guide them using Mason's layout. He knew he was out of the service, but every old skill came back, sharp as the years he wore the patch. As comms frequencies were confirmed, Mason tugged at Ethan's sleeve. The boy handed him a page he'd drawn during the night, a more detailed map of the basement, with arrows marking where the children were usually kept and the spots in the floorboards that creaked loud enough to give someone away. Ethan took it, feeling the boy's cold, sweaty hand. He set his own over it, said nothing, just gave a slow nod, a promise. Outside, the light warmed to a soft gold through the trees. The FBI team strapped on vests, checked earpieces, and loaded weapons. Metal clicked in the damp morning air, broken only by the sound of birds waking. Ethan pulled up his jacket collar, hiding most of his face, his eyes locked ahead. Claire stayed behind, handling comms and sending live satellite updates. Before leaving, Ethan knelt to Mason's level. "When we come back, there won't be anyone left in there," he said, voice low and certain. Mason didn't speak, just pressed his lips together and gave a small nod, a flicker of hope in his eyes. The convoy rolled out in silence. Tires cut dark tracks in the wet dirt, leading toward the abandoned complex. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, watching the road open up. Weeds and broken fences slid past. In his head, Mason's details replayed like a living map. Where the lights were, where the guards stood when they switched shifts. At the rally point, the vehicles stopped. The team spread out, running final checks. Ethan drew a deep breath, catching the damp forest air. Somewhere ahead, a heavy metal door slammed shut, echoing between concrete walls. A sign that the day inside had begun, and they didn't yet know this morning would be different. When the clock ticked to the mark, a voice came over comms. "West team, move. East team, stand by." Ethan tightened the straps on his pack, nodded to the man in front of him, and stepped in a line. The red lines on the map were now real footsteps, carrying them closer to a place that had only existed in a child's words hours ago. And right then, he understood. This time, he wasn't coming in as a veteran trying to stay on the sidelines. He was part of something that would change lives, his own included. The iron door rattled with a sharp clang, hinges screaming from years without oil. A white beam cut into the thick dark inside. The air hit them, damp, stale, tinged with the metallic tang of old blood and rust. Faces began to emerge from the shadows, small, wide-eyed, blinking hard against the light. A few children shielded their eyes, as if that brightness was something far too foreign, something that didn't belong in the world they'd been living in. Mason, who had been standing just behind Ethan, caught only a glimpse before rushing forward. His footsteps pounded against the patchy concrete, the rubber soles keeping time with the quickening hearts of everyone in the room. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around a smaller boy, who was trembling, his cheeks smeared with dust and the faint streaks of dried tears. No one spoke. The only thing that passed between them was the kind of grip that makes two people feel like they've fused into one. An FBI agent entered first, sweeping a flashlight across the room. His voice was low and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the fragile air. "You're safe now." The words weren't loud, but they filled the void that fear and silence had swallowed for so long. From the far corner, a little girl in a torn shirt crept toward the light, her fingers clutching the fabric like an anchor. Ethan stepped in next, scanning the room. The walls were damp and peeling, the single overhead bulb dangling dead from frayed wiring, the floor spotted with black stains you couldn't name. A thin blanket lay crumpled on the ground, half rolled, half flattened, as if fought over. He bent down and picked up a one-eyed doll, the only trace of childhood in a room that had no space for it. The rescue team began moving each child out, as carefully as if they were lifting fragile glass. Footsteps echoed up the iron stairs, broken by the soft murmur of adults trying to steady both the kids and themselves. Mason never let go, one hand locked around the boy's wrist, the other gripping Ethan's shirt like he might be pulled away. When Ethan rested a hand on his shoulder, Mason finally looked up. His eyes were wet, but bright in a way Ethan had never seen since that first night at the market. It wasn't the brightness of safety, it was the spark of knowing he wasn't alone anymore. In the hallway, the early morning chill rushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth after last night's rain. The boy in Mason's arms shivered as they crossed the threshold, but his grip began to ease. Ahead, an agent knelt and draped a thin blanket over the child's shoulders. The boy tucked his chin into the fabric, his gaze fixed on Mason. Ethan glanced back into the basement one last time. Flashlights still swept the corners, making sure no one was left. Another agent gave the all-clear, a phrase Ethan had heard countless times in the service, but never with this kind of weight. Outside, ambulances waited with their doors open. Paramedics in reflective jackets guided each child in, checking for injuries, wrapping them in blankets, offering water. Messy hair and frightened eyes disappeared behind white doors, replaced by the quiet hum of engines carrying them towards somewhere warmer, safer. Mason stood beside Ethan, watching in silence. As the last vehicle pulled away, he spoke, almost too soft to hear. "They're not going back there, eh?" Ethan answered slowly, eyes following the retreating lights. "No, my son. No one's taking them back." A breeze came through, carrying the scent of a morning just beginning, and for a moment, it felt like the gray sky had thinned enough to let a little gold light slip in. Inside the temporary care center, the air smelled of fresh soap and steam from the laundry room, mingled with the scent of chicken soup from the kitchen. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into another world. No damp walls, no cold floor, just warmth spilling from every lit doorway. Volunteers in pale blue shirts knelt to greet each child with a gentle smile. A blond boy was led to a small table where a nurse took his temperature and wrapped a white towel around his shoulders. In the corner, a little girl younger than Mason nibbled bread, her eyes still darting, as if testing whether this place could truly be trusted. Mason kept hold of his friend, the boy he'd carried out of the basement, and guided him toward a row of chairs. An older doctor with silver-rimmed glasses and kind eyes asked a few quiet questions, jotting notes before nodding at Ethan. "No serious injuries, just malnutrition and exhaustion. He'll be all right." Ethan felt some of the tightness in his shoulders release. He watched Mason follow a volunteer into another room, where neatly made, single beds stood waiting, each with a new teddy bear at the pillow. Mason hesitated, almost afraid touching anything might make it vanish. He laid his hand on the sheet, running his fingers across the fabric like he needed proof it was real. A volunteer handed him a set of striped pajamas, still smelling faintly of new cloth. Mason and a few other kids were guided toward the bathroom. The door closed, and the sound of running water filled the hallway, a steady rhythm mingling with quiet voices outside. To Ethan, every sound felt like proof that no one here would be sleeping on concrete tonight. When Mason emerged, hair damp and cheeks pink from the warm water, he looked smaller than he had in the market. He climbed into bed, but didn't lie down right away, just sat with his knees drawn up, studying the bright, orderly room. The yellow light from the ceiling spilled over neatly folded blankets at the foot of the bed. Ethan sat beside him without saying a word, remembering nights on watch in the army, when a dry blanket was enough to believe you might see another day. Mason glanced over, still a little wary, then pulled the blanket up to his chest and tested lying back. The sheet was cool and soft, the smell of laundry powder still fresh. From the bed next over, a small girl whispered to a volunteer that she'd never slept alone in a bed this big. A quiet laugh drifted across the room, not loud, but enough to stir the air. Ethan saw Mason's eyes close, his lashes trembling once, then his breathing settling into a slow, steady rhythm. Outside in the hallway, the nurse's footsteps moved in an even rhythm, the faint clink of a spoon touching porcelain in the kitchen, and the smell of soup still drifting through. Ethan rose, stepped out, giving Mason a pocket of quiet. Through the glass door, he saw the front lawn of the shelter soaked from the sprinklers, steam rising in a faint haze under the lights. He leaned back against the wall and listened. No more furtive rustling, no metallic screech of an iron door. Only the steady breathing of children who had finally found a safe place for the night. And to Ethan, that was the sweetest music he'd heard in all the years since coming back from war. The warm gold light from the ceiling cast a small halo on the worn wooden floor. Ethan sat in a chair, tucked into the corner, where darkness and light overlapped. Across from him, Mason slept on his side, his breathing steady, but his hand still clutching a fold of Ethan's thick coat. Even though he'd been changed in his striped pajamas, that hand wouldn't let go, as if it were the last anchor tying him to a world that had only just become safe. Outside, the soft patter of night, rain tapped against the window frame, broken now and then by the slow crawl of a truck passing the wet road in front of the shelter. The room's door stayed ajar, letting in a thin strip of light from the hallway, where a few volunteers still moved quietly. They exchanged low whispers, but the sound was no more than wind slipping between wooden walls. A young reporter had paused at the doorway more than once, notebook in hand, eyes waiting. But Ethan didn't signal for him to come in. It wasn't that he didn't want the story told. He just knew that one question right now could be enough to startle Mason awake. Some wounds, Ethan understood, shouldn't be touched the moment they start to close. He looked at Mason, thin face, faint scratches along the chin, lips closed in sleep. Each time the boy took a deeper breath, his shirt rose and fell, and his fingers gave a small squeeze. The gesture pulled Ethan back to nights on watch in the field, when his squad slept in dugouts, hands still looped through the sling of their rifles, as if that alone could guarantee they'd see the morning. The faint scent of new soap from Mason's pajamas blended with the old wood smell of the room. It reminded Ethan of his mother's house, where his father would sit up all night by the window, listening to the tick of the clock and watching the streetlight outside. As a boy, Ethan had often fallen asleep beside his father's chair, gripping his wrist, afraid that if he let go, he'd wake up in another world. A volunteer stepped in, setting down a fresh cup of coffee for Ethan. He just nodded his thanks, resting the cup on the table without taking a sip. The steam fogged his glasses for a moment, then disappeared as quickly as a breath on the porch. Everything here was soft and slow, the opposite of the sharp hiss and burnt gunpowder smell of those other days. Mason shifted, kicking lightly at the blanket. Ethan reached over, pulling it up to the boy's shoulders, a motion that felt as familiar as if he'd done it all his life. Mason sighed in his sleep, his grip still there, but looser now. Ethan stayed leaned over, leaving his hand close by, in case the boy reached out for it again. The wind outside the window shifted, picking up speed, driving the rain in long streaks across the glass. A hallway light flickered once, then steadied. In the corner of the room, the wall clock ticked in slow, deliberate beats, each one pressing the silence deeper. Ethan knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but he allowed himself to stay, not thinking about tomorrow, not about the investigation, not about the testimony. All he knew was that, at least for tonight, Mason wouldn't have to fear the sound of footsteps crunching over wet gravel, or the screech of iron hinges on a basement door. And for the first time in months, Ethan himself wouldn't have to fall asleep with a folding knife hidden under his pillow. Out there, the world kept moving. News would spread. The story would be torn apart in the headlines. But here, in the small room of the temporary care center, there was only an old soldier sitting in the quiet, and a boy clutching the hem of his coat as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the sound of the rain blend with Mason's breathing, forming a kind of music he hadn't heard in years, a sound that promised nothing except the stillness of the present. On the table, a single file lay apart from the others. Morning light slipped through the small window, falling across a bold printed line, temporary guardianship. Beneath it were the cold details, child's name, date of birth, legal status, the box marked no legal guardian remaining. Ethan sat on one side of the table, a black ballpoint pen within easy reach. Across from him, the social worker, a woman in her 50s, with streaks of silver framing her face, waited quietly. She didn't speak much, only gave a slight nod when he looked up. In that moment, Ethan could hear the clock ticking in the next room, each beat slow, as if reminding him this wasn't a decision to be made lightly. Mason sat in a chair against the far wall, legs swinging, eyes tracking Ethan's every move. He wore a new hoodie a volunteer had brought, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as though afraid someone might call him away at any moment. The way he kept silent reminded Ethan of himself as a boy, sitting in his grandfather's office at the town hall, while the adults discussed matters far beyond his reach. Ethan picked up the pen and moved it toward the blank line. His first name came easily, each stroke familiar. But when he reached relationship to the child, his hand stopped. That space didn't feel meant for short, detached words like guardian or caretaker. He knew he could write temporary to keep his distance, to avoid making a promise he wasn't certain he could keep for a lifetime. But the image of Mason the night before, sleeping with his small hand still fisted in the folds of Ethan's coat, swept in and filled all the space for hesitation. The pen trembled slightly, the letters leaning, but still clear. Father. He wrote it slowly, as if each line of ink were a long breath drawn deep. When the final period landed, Ethan felt his chest loosen, as though something heavy had been set down at last. The social worker gathered the file, flipped through it quickly to check the signature, then slid it into a brown folder. "That's all for the paperwork," she said, her voice no louder than it needed to be, as if she didn't want to disturb the quiet in the room. Mason looked up when she left, his eyes lingering on Ethan's hand still resting on the table. He didn't ask anything, just stood, walked over slowly and tugged at Ethan's sleeve. A small gesture, but enough for Ethan to know the boy understood, in his own way, what had just happened. They stepped outside together. The rain had eased, leaving the pavement damp, reflecting a pale gray sky. The smell of wet earth mixed with the resin scent from the pines lining the road. Ethan didn't take Mason's hand, but he slowed his stride so they walked side by side. Whenever a truck passed and sent a gust of wind their way, Mason leaned in slightly, and Ethan shifted his shoulder to block it. On the way back to the center, they stopped at a small corner store. Ethan bought a paper bag of things, a toothbrush, a box of crayons, and a blank notebook. Mason's eyes lingered on the notebook longer than they needed to, as if trying to figure out who it was for. Ethan didn't explain, just paid and handed the bag over for the boy to carry. Back in the room, Mason set the bag on the old wooden table. He pulled out the notebook, opened it to the first page, and placed a pencil on it, but didn't write a word. Ethan sat on the bed beside him, watching without pushing. He knew some things had to wait until a kid was ready to tell them. Late afternoon light slipped through the blinds, laying long stripes across the floor. Mason stayed hunched over the notebook, and Ethan leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed but ears tuned to the sound of kids playing outside. The voices weren't Mason's, but Ethan hoped one day they would be. On the table, the file in its brown folder sat where the social worker had left it. It wasn't just paper. To Ethan, it felt like a promise, a step away from the years when he'd only lived for himself. And though nothing was said, he knew Mason felt that invisible thread pulling them closer. The shadows stretched, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a man standing outside his own life. This hug wasn't rushed like the others had been. It wasn't the quick, hesitant touch of a kid afraid he might be pushed away. Mason stood there, arms around Ethan's waist, breathing slow against the thick fabric of his coat. The faint scent of the center's soap clung to his hair, mixing with the damp trace of the afternoon rain. Ethan lowered his chin until it brushed the boy's messy hair. He didn't say a word. Some moments lose their shape if you try to put them into sentences. Outside the window, the sun dipped low, pouring a heavy gold light across the roof of the house across the street. That light caught in Mason's hair, turning the strands into fine gold threads against the sun-darkened skin and the faint shadows under his eyes. The wind outside stirred the worn curtains. On the table, the notebook lay open, still untouched. The pencil rested across the edge of the page, its wooden casing worn smooth. Ethan felt Mason's arms tighten around him when a distant car horn echoed from the street, as if the sound carried a memory of the place the boy had just escaped. He lifted a hand and patted Mason's back, slow, steady. It was the only way he knew to say, "I'm here, not going anywhere." In the service, pats like that were for comrades who'd just been through something rough. No need for words, just the weight of knowing someone stood beside you. Outside, the late day light stretched long, the gold fading into gray. The damp scent of wood rose from the floorboards as the air cooled. Ethan knew they'd have to light the stove soon, but he didn't want to break the moment. Time felt suspended. The two of them just stood there in that small room, letting the last light of the day slip over their shoulders, through their hair, and sink into the dark. Mason shifted slightly, not letting go, only enough to tilt his head back and look up. For the first time since Ethan had met him at the night market, those eyes weren't purely guarded or measuring. There was something softer there now, even if still careful. Ethan understood. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It's laid down in thin, fragile layers. Over each meal, each time you open your door to let someone in, each blanket you pull up over them in the middle of the night. They sat down together on the edge of the bed. Ethan reached into his jacket and brought out an old silver coin, its surface worn so thin the engraving was barely visible. "This used to be my dad's," he said quietly, not pressing Mason for an answer. "He carried it every time he left home. Keep it, to remember there's always a way back." Mason looked at the coin for a long moment, then slipped it into his own pocket without a word. Outside the window, footsteps passed along the alley, then faded. In the room, only the soft creak of wood as the wind slipped through the cracks in the door. Ethan stood, drew the curtain closed, leaving just a thin seam of gold at the fabric's edge. He lit the stove. The smell of burning wood spread, warm and mild. Mason dragged a chair closer, watching the tiny sparks rise and vanish into the red coals. Dinner that night was just leftover soup from lunch, reheated in the cast iron pot. But Mason finished it all, and for the first time, he got up on his own to carry his bowl to the sink. A small thing, but to Ethan it felt like the boy was quietly confirming. He was starting to think of this place as home. When night settled in, Ethan turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the fire's glow casting orange-red patterns on the walls. Mason sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes half closed, and Ethan stayed beside him, his hand resting on the back of the chair. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but right now, in that quiet room, he could feel the kind of ties that don't need any paperwork to prove, and they had already begun to form. Outside, the night wind moved over the rooftops, carrying the scent of pine and the dry rustle of leaves. Inside, two people who'd once been strangers now shared the same silence, as if the whole town had stepped back far enough for them to hear each other's heartbeat in the stillness. The late afternoon light had poured across the porch in deep golden streaks, slipping over the weathered boards. Mason sat with his knees drawn up, a sheet of paper on his lap, his pencil moving slowly, like every line needed careful thought. The straight edges of the roof, the frame of a window, the square block of light spilling outward, all taking shape under a hand still unpracticed but precise. Ethan stood behind him, leaning quietly against the doorframe. He didn't need to ask what Mason was drawing. The image was already clear. A house lit up in the dark, its door wide open, and two figures standing on steps. The way Mason gripped the pencil, tightening slightly as he sketched the curve of one figure's arm around the other, told Ethan this wasn't just a drawing. It was a wish laid down on paper, made into something you could see, something you could touch. He stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. Through the thin fabric, the warmth carried over, just enough for the boy to pause for a moment. Mason didn't look up, only tilted his head slightly to acknowledge it was him, then went back to shading the light spilling from the doorway. The last of the day's sunlight slanted in, catching in the boy's messy hair and turning it a deep copper glow. From the yard came the first stirrings of crickets, blending with a whisper of wind moving through the line of pines at the edge of the property. The scent of warm wood from the fireplace still clung to Ethan's clothes, mixing with the damp earth smell left behind by last night's rain. In that stillness, time seemed to slow. He thought of evenings at the outpost, when his buddies bent over paper, writing letters home, each word like a thread, trying to hold them to a place called home. Mason, in his own way, was doing the same thing. A stronger gust swept across the porch, spinning a few dry leaves before dropping them by the steps. Mason reached out to steady the page, fingertips smudged with a trace of soot from the porch rail. Ethan stayed silent. He knew that, sometimes, the best way to help a child feel safe was not to question their dreams, not to press them into the frame adults think they should fit. The picture took shape, windows glowing as if full of warmth, a stone walkway clean and even, and two figures standing close, not detailed enough to show their faces, but near enough to speak of closeness. Mason added soft pencil strokes to deepen the dark behind them, as if to say, the light matters because it rises out of the dark. Ethan gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping inside to make 2 mugs of hot cocoa. When he came back, Mason had set the drawing on the porch step to let the breeze dry the graphite. The boy took the cocoa with both hands, the heat bringing a faint flush to his cheeks. They sat side by side, both looking out over a yard washed in the gold of a fading sunset. Far off, the neighbor's wind chime rang, swaying in the breeze. Mason took a small sip, set his mug down, and picked up the drawing again. He didn't hand it to Ethan, just flipped it over and wrote a few small words he couldn't read from where he sat. When he was done, he folded it and slipped it into the sketchbook he'd carried since the day Ethan met him at the care center. Ethan realized that in this journey, the biggest changes often began with things so small an outsider might miss them entirely: a hand resting on a shoulder, a drawing, a word hidden on the back of a page. This was how Mason rebuilt trust. Thin bricks, but solid. When the last light slipped from the porch, leaving only the warm glow of the living room filtering through the doorway, Mason quietly gathered his pencils and paper, tucking them neatly away. He stood, hesitated, then spoke softly, almost in a whisper, "I think tomorrow I'll draw a tree in the front yard." Ethan just nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. No need to say he was looking forward to it. The two of them stepped inside, leaving the wooden porch empty, the smell of cocoa still hanging in the air. Outside, night was arriving slowly, but in the house, the light stayed warm and open, like the very picture Mason had just drawn. Evening settled in unhurriedly, as if the whole town was tired from a long day. The wind carried the scent of burning wood from someone's fireplace, slipping across the porch where Mason still sat with his sketchbook open on his lap. The glow from inside stretched in a long golden line, brushing the edge of the paper. Ethan sat just inside the doorway, his eyes following each slow, deliberate stroke of the boy's pencil. The drawing was almost finished now, Two figures in front of a small house, the doors slightly ajar, lights spilling out. None of the lines were perfectly straight, and the colored lead was fading in places, but every mark carried a kind of care, like he was drawing something that wasn't allowed to disappear. Ethan stepped out and set a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. The boy didn't look up, just tilted his head slightly, as if to let that hand stay a while longer. Far off, the main street was nearly empty. Streetlights cast soft halos on a damp asphalt, speckled with wet leaves. A gray cat crossed the road, its shadow splitting in two under the lamp. From the porch, Ethan watched it, his mind drifting back to that crumpled piece of paper from the bus station. A scrap so thin it could have easily landed in a dirty puddle, been carried into a gutter, or crushed in someone's fist and tossed away. He gave Mason's shoulder a small squeeze. The boy kept at his work, pausing now and then to shade in the bright window. Ethan could feel the warmth through the thin fabric of the boy's shirt, a feeling both fragile and steady. Joy, he realized, isn't found in loud moments, but in quiet ones like this, when you know there's something worth keeping, worth guarding, and you're ready to do whatever it takes not to lose it. The night wind lifted a few older sketches left on the porch. Ethan bent down quickly to catch them before they blew away. He knew that for some people, everything could start with something as simple as stopping, bending down, and picking up what looked like nothing. He stood behind Mason, letting the silence speak for him. And somewhere in his thoughts, a question drifted by, aimed at no one in particular. How many people would stop, just for a crumpled piece of paper? That night, the house was quiet, as if it was holding the breath of both of them. Mason slept in the freshly painted small room, the door left slightly ajar, a strip of warm light spilling across the hallway. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling halfway in the cup, his hands still carrying the warmth from before he'd closed the boy's door. Outside, the night wind swept over the porch, carrying the scent of dry leaves and a trace of wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. He thought about all the things that had brought them here, a crumpled note, a pause in the road, and a silence long enough to hear what someone couldn't put into words. Some journeys don't begin with grand plans, but with the small details we can't bring ourselves to let go of. And sometimes, those details end up saving an entire life. If you've ever had a moment that made you stop, look closer, listen longer, I'd like to hear your story. Somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for a person willing to stop.